It was in the waning days of March, the year 1895, that I found myself once again ensconced in the cosy, if somewhat chaotic quarters of 221B Baker Street. The afternoon was grey, with low clouds hanging like a sullen veil over London, and a dreary drizzle painting the windows with streaks that obscured the street below. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me in his usual armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, and his face exhibiting the serene stillness of one lost in deep contemplation or boredom. One could rarely tell the difference. I had been attempting to read the Lancet, but my attention faltered as I watched Holmes. He had not taken a case in nearly 10 days, and his silence had become more brooding by the hour. "I suspect," I said, breaking the silence, "that unless a baronet is murdered in his bath by a Tibetan monk within the next hour, you will throw yourself out of the window from sheer ennui." Holmes opened one eye. "Would that I could find a Tibetan monk who murdered baronets, Watson. Alas, the papers today have offered little more than jewel thefts of the common variety, and a forged letter from the Admiralty so transparent it might have been written in smoke." He rose and paced to the window, then turned suddenly at the sound of boots on the stairs. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared with her usual knock and the announcement, "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She's in a terrible state." "Show her in at once," said Holmes, springing back into his chair with sudden alertness, like a hound scenting fox. The woman who entered was young, no more than 25, and pale beneath the veil she wore. Her gloves trembled in her lap as she sat where Holmes gestured. "Miss?" Holmes inquired, without waiting for Mrs. Hudson to close the door. "Elsie Reedon," she said, her voice soft but strained. "Mr. Holmes, I believe I have remembered something terrible. But too late, I fear. Far too late." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "Go on, Miss Reedon." She looked to me and then back to Holmes, as though steeling herself. I witnessed something over a month ago. It seemed innocuous at the time, just a man dropping a package in the street, but I now think he meant for someone else to collect it. I think it may be connected to a death. A young woman. Her name was Clara Penmore." Holmes's brows lifted a fraction. "Clara Penmore, the companion to Lady Rutledge of St. James Square." Miss Reedon nodded, tears welling at the corners of her eyes. "Yes. She died 3 days after I saw the man in Henrietta Place. The police said she collapsed due to a weak heart, but I heard things that suggest it may not have been natural. And now you come to me. I was afraid," she confessed. "But yesterday I saw a man, the same one from Henrietta Place, standing outside my boarding house, just watching. I know it sounds mad, but I remembered. Something else, something vital, and I know it now. I know that Clara didn't simply die." Holmes steepled his fingers again. "What exactly did you recall, Miss Reedon?" Her eyes darted toward the window, then back. The package he dropped. It was small, wrapped in plain paper. "I didn't think much of it until yesterday, but as I lay awake last night, I remembered something very odd. The man wasn't startled when he dropped it. He looked around, deliberately. Then he walked away without trying to retrieve it. And more curiously, Clara was there. She bent and picked it up. Holmes stood and walked to the fire. And this occurred 1 month prior to her death. Almost to the day." "Curious," he murmured. "And tell me, Miss Reedon, have you any enemies?" She shook her head. "None. I keep to myself. I teach music. I knew Clara only in passing. We sometimes rode the same omnibus." "And this man you saw again. Can you describe him?" She hesitated. He was tall, wore a dark coat with a velvet collar. I think he had a slight limp, and he carried an umbrella, even though it was dry. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you recall the obituary last week of a woman found collapsed in Rutledge Square garden?" I nodded. "Heart failure. The papers dismissed it. And yet now we have a witness. unwitting at first, but troubled enough to come forward. Holmes faced Miss Reedon again. "You did right to come to me. I believe your instincts are sharper than most. There is something rotten behind Miss Penmore's death, and you may be in danger for having remembered it." Miss Reedon's hands trembled anew. "Then I beg you, Mr. Holmes, find out what truly happened. I don't want Clara's memory, or mine, to die unheeded." Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. "Watson, fetch your coat. We are going to St. James Square." "Now?" I asked, though the question was rhetorical. Holmes was already reaching for his cloak. He turned to Miss Reedon. "Stay here tonight, Miss Reedon. Mrs. Hudson will see to your comfort. You are safer here under my roof than in your lodgings." "But I've already been gone for—" Holmes held up a hand. "No arguments. The man you saw is watching you. Let him watch an empty window." Miss Reedon, shaken but relieved, nodded. Holmes offered a quick nod in return and was already halfway down the stairs before I could catch up with my revolver and hat. As the fog clung to our collars and the gas lamps flickered in the dusk, Holmes spoke with the energy of one who had finally glimpsed a spark in the darkness. "She remembered," he said, "and she remembered just in time. But someone is counting on her, having remembered too late." The hansom cab clattered down Oxford Street and turned southward toward St. James Square, the gaslights casting long, flickering shadows through the veil of mist that now enveloped the city like a shroud. Holmes was silent. For most of the journey, his eyes narrowed as he traced invisible patterns on the frosted glass window beside him. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts, though the mystery already churned restlessly within my own mind. Clara Penmore, a name I recalled only faintly from the society pages, had been described as a modest, well-bred companion to the widowed Lady Rutledge. No scandal, no strange habits. Her passing, by all accounts, had aroused little suspicion. But now, with Miss Reedon's frightened recollections and Holmes's immediate interest, the case had taken on the air of hidden menace. At precisely 5:30, we arrived outside the Rutledge residence. It was a tall Georgian house, grand yet sombre, standing watch over the square with shuttered eyes. A liveried footman led us into a parlor dressed in dark green velvet and sombre oil paintings. The faint scent of lavender and age hung in the air. Lady Rutledge soon appeared, a stately woman in her late 50s, her posture rigid and her expression guarded. She wore mourning black, though I noted there was no fresh crepe, an indication that Clara's death had perhaps not warranted a deep period of grief. "I received no note, Mr. Holmes," she said crisply as she entered. "May I ask what this is in regard to?" Holmes bowed slightly. "Forgive the unannounced visit, Lady Rutledge. I seek only a few moments. You were recently attended by a young woman named Clara Penmore." Her expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Clara was my companion for the better part of 2 years. She died quite suddenly." "Indeed. The circumstances of her passing, have they troubled you?" "I was shocked, naturally," she said, her eyes cooling. "But the doctor assured me it was a heart complaint." Clara had mentioned breathlessness at times. Holmes gave a slight nod and turned as though to survey the room, his gaze touching on a side table where a small clock ticked steadily beneath a silver-framed photograph. "Forgive my impertinence," he murmured, "but may I ask, had Miss Penmore received any parcels or correspondence on the day of her collapse?" Lady Rutledge stiffened. "I don't know. Her belongings were modest, and I did not inspect her things in detail. Would you object to my examining her effects?" She hesitated, then said slowly, "I see no harm in it. Most of her items were packed and placed in the attic. No one has touched them since." "I would be most grateful," Holmes said. "Watson, would you accompany Lady Rutledge's man upstairs and retrieve the box?" It took some time for the dusty trunk to be brought down. Holmes remained by the window, his arms folded, eyes distant. I noted his gaze lingered on the opposite building, a tall, narrow house with curtained windows. As the butler set down the trunk, Holmes crossed the room in a few long strides and crouched beside it. He opened the lid and, methodically, began lifting. The contents: a few books of poetry, a faded shawl, some letters tied with blue ribbon, and a cosmetics pouch. He sniffed the cloth items, examined the lining of the box, and finally paused at a flat brown envelope tucked at the bottom. "Interesting," he murmured, lifting it gently. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes untied the flap and removed a sheet of heavy writing paper. "It appears to be an invitation to a private recital held at the residence of one Doctor, Felix Darnley, a name I do not recognize. The date, notably, is 2 days before Clara's death." He held it up. "And look here, just at the edge. There is a faint smudge. Not ink. Powder, perhaps. Chemical." Lady Rutledge, who had said little since the search began, now spoke. "Darnley. Yes, I remember. Clara did mention she had been invited by a friend to hear a violinist perform. She returned late that evening." Holmes's brow furrowed. "Did she seem altered in any way upon her return?" "She seemed distracted. Her eyes were red, and I assumed she had wept. But she said nothing." Holmes slipped the envelope into his pocket. "Thank you, Lady Rutledge. You have been most helpful." Outside, the fog had thickened, turning the gas lamps into soft orbs that hovered in the mist. We walked in silence until we reached the corner, at which point Holmes turned abruptly. "Darnley," he said. "I recall the name now. He was a chemist before taking up an amateur interest in music. A peculiar man, known for frequent correspondence with obscure medical journals." "You suspect him?" "I suspect an event that led to tears and silence from a previously composed woman. The recital may have been a ruse. We must pay Dr. Darnley a visit." "Tonight?" "There is no time to waste, Watson. Whoever watched Miss Reeden may now know she has spoken. If Clara Penmore received something toxic, delivered subtly, we may be on the trail of a murderer, skilled in misdirection." Holmes flagged down another cab, and we rattled through the city once more, this time to Bloomsbury. Darnley's address led us to a brick townhouse wedged between a tobacconist's and an antiquarian bookshop. The sign above the door bore the name Dr. Felix Darnley, musician and lecturer, in worn gold lettering. A thin, grey-haired man opened the door. His eyes, pale and unblinking, rested on us with academic detachment. "I'm Dr. Darnley. May I help you?" Holmes stepped forward. "Forgive the interruption, Doctor. My name is Sherlock Holmes. I wish to ask you about a recital you hosted last month. A Miss Clara Penmore was in attendance." Darnley did not flinch, but there was a noticeable stillness to his frame. "Yes," he said slowly. "I remember her. She was brought by another guest. She seemed sensitive. Left early." "May we come in?" There was a pause. Then, with a stiff gesture, he allowed us into a narrow hall lined with shelves of violin cases and dusty anatomical drawings. The parlour smelled faintly of camphor and varnish. Holmes walked the room slowly, his hands behind his back. "You did not know Miss Penmore personally?" She was quiet. I assumed she was merely shy. Holmes turned. "Were any of the refreshments unusual?" Darnley blinked. "Tea and biscuits. I prepared them myself." "No punch?" "No aperitif." "Certainly not. I don't drink." Holmes studied him. "Were any of your other guests physicians?" "A few." "Chemists?" "I wouldn't know," Darnley replied coldly. "Mr. Holmes, is there a reason for this interrogation?" Holmes paused. "Miss Penmore is dead. I believe something occurred at your recital that precipitated her collapse days later. You say she left early. Do you recall what disturbed her?" Darnley hesitated. "Now that you mention it, yes. A gentleman, young, with a prominent birthmark on his temple, said something to her. She paled and excused herself. Holmes turned to me sharply. "Watson, do you recall Miss Reedon's description of the man who watched her boarding house? Tall, limpio, carried an umbrella. And now a birthmark," I added. Darnley's voice faltered. "You think he poisoned her?" Holmes looked him in the eye. "I think he ensured she was present at your home. And what she witnessed there, what she touched, heard or consumed, sealed her fate. The means and motive remain hidden, but not for long." As we left Darnley's house and stepped back into the fog-laced night, Holmes turned to me with a glint in his eye that I had come to recognize. "We are close now, Watson. Very close. The truth lies not in what Clara remembered, but in what she never had the chance to say." And with that, he stepped into the swirling mist, his silhouette dissolving like a ghost on the trail of murder. We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, the streets hushed beneath a low-hanging fog that rolled in from the Thames like a silent tide. Miss Reedon had fallen asleep in the armchair by the hearth, a shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. Holmes motioned to me not to wake her. He moved quietly about the room, striking a match to relight his pipe, and then stood by the fire, his expression unreadable. "She is right to be afraid," he said after a pause. "Whoever orchestrated Clara Penmore's death is still at large, and keen to keep any loose threads from unraveling. You believe the man with the birthmark deliberately orchestrated an encounter at the recital?" "More than that," Holmes said. "He engineered the entire situation. Darnley's gathering served only one purpose, to get Clara into that room. What occurred there, what was said, shown, or given to her, was the first domino. The rest fell with chilling precision." I lowered myself into my chair, my notebook open but untouched. "And the birthmark? It may prove critical. Watson, think. A birthmark is not a mere blemish. It is a signature. A man so marked must know he cannot disappear in a crowd. He uses shadows and distance. He watches. He does not act directly unless he must." Holmes moved to his desk and pulled down a battered volume of the medical directory. "Let us assume," he continued, flipping pages rapidly, "that this man is a professional, someone acquainted with chemistry, physiology, or perhaps even toxicology. Miss Penmore's death was too neat to be improvised." He stopped at a page and tapped it. "Ah, Dr. Oberon Tyne, trained at Edinburgh, briefly affiliated with the Royal College. Published a monograph on alkaloid compounds used in cardiac treatments. Left practice suddenly 3 years ago. No obituary, no scandal. He simply vanished from the professional sphere." "Why him?" Holmes turned the book toward me. A faint etching showed a sharp-featured man with a dark blotch just above the temple. It wasn't large, but unmistakable once one knew where to look. "I remember reading a letter he wrote to the Lancet, months ago," Holmes said. "Full of vitriol, deeply paranoid. He believed rivals were stealing his research." I leaned forward. "You think Clara Penmore somehow discovered him?" "Possibly. Or worse, perhaps she recognized him. Perhaps she knew Oberon Tyne not as a doctor, but in some personal context, a failed suitor, a dismissed employee. Her reaction at the recital, tears and silence, suggests sudden fear, not confusion. She may not have remembered him until it was too late." At that moment, Miss Reedon stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with momentary confusion. Holmes was immediately at her side, speaking gently. "You are safe, Miss Reedon, but we are closer now. I must ask, do you recall if Clara ever mentioned a man named Tyne, or perhaps someone she feared without admitting it?" Miss Reedon sat upright, pressing her hand to her brow. "Tyne. No, that doesn't sound familiar. But she did speak of someone once. She called him the gentleman with the glove. It was a passing remark, weeks before she died. I assumed it was some romantic affair." Holmes straightened. A curious turn of phrase. "She said he always wore one glove, left hand, even indoors." Holmes turned to me sharply. "That confirms it. Tyne suffered from mild hemiparesis on his left side. an after effect of mercury poisoning from his own experiments. He would conceal the tremor. She never named him, Miss Reedon whispered, but she said something strange, that he made her feel like she was standing in a room with no doors. Holmes gave a curt nod, his expression growing darker. We have a name, a method, and a motive forming. Tyne's obsession with medical compounds, his bitterness, and Clara's fear all point to the same source. We slept little that night. Holmes wrote several telegrams at dawn, one to the Royal College of Surgeons requesting archived records, another to Scotland Yard, with a vague but urgent inquiry regarding recent sightings of a tall man with a facial birthmark near Bloomsbury and Henrietta Place. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, his overcoat damp with morning drizzle. Holmes brought him quickly up to speed, including our visit to Dr. Darnley and the recital. Lestrade frowned. You want me to pursue a man who hasn't been charged, hasn't been seen in years, and may or may not exist under his own name. I want you to find out if a Dr. Oberon Tyne is renting any rooms or laboratories under aliases. Holmes said crisply. Also, inquire into private chemists' suppliers. Ask if any tall gentleman with a gloved hand has purchased cardiac alkaloids in the last 3 months. Lestrade sighed but jotted notes. And the Reedon girl. She stays here until we are certain she's not being watched. If Tyne knows she remembers the Henrietta Place incident, he may attempt to silence her. Holmes turned to the hearth again, lost in thought. Then he spoke, almost absently. Watson, have you noticed how clean the envelope was that contained the recital invitation? I blinked. Clean. Spotless. Despite being over a month old and stored at the bottom of a trunk, there was no dust, no discoloration. Someone placed it there recently. Someone who wanted it to be found. My spine straightened. You mean, someone is leading us? Precisely. Either Tyne or an accomplice left it. Not carelessly, but deliberately. They want us to follow a trail. But why? Why lead us to Darnley? Holmes smiled grimly. To divert us, or to measure how close we are. The trail is real enough, but its purpose may be layered. We must follow it carefully. By late afternoon, Lestrade returned with a lead. A Mr. Algernon Blythe, operating out of a disused printing shop in Clerkenwell, had purchased a variety of chemical supplies under cash-only arrangements. The description matched: tall, limp left glove. Blythe, Holmes repeated, a name soft enough to sound forgettable. He rose at once. Come, Watson, we go to Clerkenwell, but tread lightly. If Tyne senses we are on to him, he may burn everything behind him, including any witnesses. As we wound through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell, a subtle unease settled over me. The case had grown from a frightened woman's memory into a cat-and-mouse game with a shadowy figure whose intelligence mirrored Holmes's own, and whose ruthlessness may prove fatal. When we arrived at the printing shop, the windows were dark and the alley reeked faintly of ammonia and ash. Holmes examined the lock. Recently forced, but not by police. Someone came here in haste. He pushed the door open and we stepped into a narrow room stacked with crates and broken type. At the rear, a small laboratory had been set up. Rows of flasks, dried herbs, pipettes. But the workspace had been ransacked, paper strewn across the floor, and a single glove, left-handed, lay discarded beside a scorched burner. Holmes moved quickly, lifting bottles and opening drawers. Then he stopped at a charred scrap near the burner. He handed it to me. A letter, I murmured. Only a fragment left. The words were faded and blackened, but still legible. If she speaks to anyone, especially him, you know what must be done. Holmes's mouth tightened. He knew she would remember, but the question is, did he act already? Or is he watching, waiting for us to lead him to her? And with that chilling thought, we turned back into the fog, the game now hurtling toward a dangerous climax. We returned to Baker Street just as dusk crept over London once more, its familiar shroud of soot-stained fog settling thick over the rooftops and street lamps. Holmes was unusually silent, save for the soft rustle of the charred letter fragment in his coat pocket. I could sense the shifting gravity of his thoughts, the mounting tension in the air, not merely the pursuit of a man now named and partially seen, but the sudden realization that they were being drawn forward by calculated design. Inside, Miss Reedon sat at the window, her expression strained, fingers tightening around a teacup that trembled faintly in her grasp. She rose as we entered, a question hanging unspoken in her gaze. "He was there," Holmes said without preamble, tossing his hat onto the hook and moving swiftly to the fireplace. The laboratory had been cleared out with surgical precision. The glove was left deliberately, almost theatrically. "Then he knows you're following him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes looked up, and for a moment there was an odd gleam in his eye. Not fear, but the sharpened edge of anticipation. "He knows, and more than that, he's adapting." I crossed the room and offered Miss Reedon a reassuring nod. "There was no evidence to suggest he's taken action against you," I said gently. "But Holmes believes he may be watching, and so we must stay one step ahead." She set the cup down. "I keep thinking, what if I'd spoken sooner? Would Clara have—" "No," Holmes said curtly, but not unkindly. "Regret is a luxury, Miss Reedon. What matters now is that your memory may yet preserve your own life and reveal a truth Tyne has tried very hard to bury." He turned then and retrieved the envelope from Clara Penmore's trunk, laying it beside the burnt fragment from the lab. His fingers traced invisible lines between them, both left deliberately. The recital invitation pointed us to Darnley, but it was the laboratory that revealed intent. Tyne is not merely running. He's removing pieces from the board. "And the note?" I asked. "He fears she may speak to someone. Especially him," the fragment reads. "That pronoun is key." Holmes looked up sharply. "Watson, what if the person Clara feared? What if the gentleman with the glove wasn't Tyne at all?" I stared at him. "But the man Miss Reedon saw, the one who dropped the parcel, fits Tyne's description. He was seen again near her residence. The glove, the limp, the height." "Yes," Holmes said, eyes alight. "But we made the critical error of assuming he was the threat Clara knew. Suppose instead Tyne was following her." Miss Reedon's voice caught. "You mean Clara was being pursued by someone else? And Tyne might have been observing, investigating, or even trying to stop something. If he's become more recluse than villain, his methods may have changed, but not his caution." "But the poison," I pressed, "the recital, the chemistry, all signs point to Tyne." Holmes moved to his violin and plucked a single note, letting it resonate in the silence before answering. "And yet a man who intends to kill quietly, Watson, does not wait weeks. He would strike cleanly, efficiently, without delay." "No. Something else was afoot that night, and I believe Clara Penmore discovered it not by accident, but because she was already suspicious." He turned then, the bow dropping gently to his side. "We need to speak to someone who knew her more intimately, someone not aristocratic, not peripheral. Watson, there was a name in the address book inside Clara's trunk, a Margaret Elvins of Limehouse. If Clara confided in anyone, it would not be her employer. It would be a friend from a quieter world." We left at once, instructing Mrs. Hudson to keep Miss Reedon safe behind a locked door and under no circumstance to admit any unknown visitors. The journey to Limehouse took us eastward, the fog thickening to a damp wall of obscurity that swallowed gaslight and footfall alike. It was a grim part of the city, coiled with alleys and half-lit public houses, but Holmes navigated it with precise steps. Margaret Elvins turned out to be a modest, no-nonsense seamstress in her early 40s, who answered the door with a suspicion that only softened when Holmes offered Clara's name. She was a good girl, Elvin said, ushering us into a tight little parlour that smelled of tea and camphor. Too good for the place she worked in, truth be told. You mean Lady Rutledge's house? Elvins nodded sharply. It wasn't her ladyship, no, but there was someone else who visited often, a Mr. Trafford. Polite, but wrong somehow. Clara didn't like being in the same room as him. Holmes stilled. Did she say why? She wouldn't, not directly. But she once told me he smiled like he'd forgotten how to do it properly. Like a man who had practiced it. Did she ever mention a man named Tyne? Number, but she did mention being followed once. Said she saw the same man outside Rutledge House 3 times in a week. A man with a bad leg. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. She was scared. Elvins continued. More than she let on. I told her to come stay, here if she needed, but she said she had to keep working, that she couldn't just run. Then came that recital. She told me she was going because someone she trusted needed her to hear something. I thought it was about music. Holmes's jaw tightened. She went to the recital not to socialize, but to listen, to observe. Or to confirm, I added quietly. Elvins nodded, eyes sad. She never came back here again. Next I knew she was dead. Holmes stood, brushing his coat. Thank you, Mrs. Elvins. You have been extremely helpful. I believe Clara entrusted you with more than you realize. As we stepped back into the night, Holmes was unusually quiet again, until we reached the end of the alley, and he said in a low voice, Watson, we've been wrong from the start. I stopped. How so? This was never a murder of passion or convenience. It's a cover-up. He looked up at the fog-choked sky, brows drawn. Clara was a witness, not a target, until she knew too much. Trafford, the strange visitor, he fits the profile. A man of means with access to private spaces at Rutledge House. And if Clara saw something, an exchange perhaps, or an object passed between hands, then the recital may have been a second attempt. Not by Tyne, but by Trafford. And Tyne may have been watching her to stop it. I stared at Holmes. Then we must find Trafford. He nodded once. We must, and quickly. Because if Trafford realizes Miss Reedon is retracing Clara's steps, he won't make the same mistake twice. And so we pressed forward, 2 steps behind a man who had slipped through high society under a borrowed smile, and just 1 step ahead of a noose, slowly tightening around the last woman who remembered. The following morning broke with a brittle light that did little to warm the streets of Baker Street, yet within our rooms the atmosphere was taut with urgency. Holmes had barely touched his breakfast, choosing instead to stand by the window, his eyes fixed on the street below, where a delivery boy shuffled past, whistling through the morning chill. The fog had thinned but lingered still, wrapping London in a veil that seemed too fitting for the case we now pursued. Watson, Holmes said without turning, we must locate Trafford before dusk. We are no longer pursuing a murderer in hiding. We are tracking a man confident enough to move in plain sight, shielded by wealth and reputation. And how do we find him? I asked, folding the newspaper. Lady Rutledge never mentioned the name. She wouldn't, Holmes replied. Either she fears him or she's protecting him. Either way, the omission is significant, but there is another route. Trafford's presence must have left a mark. Men like him do not walk unnoticed through the corridors of power. He moved to his desk and drew out a small stack of visiting cards and notes from the Rutledge trunk. Look here, he said, holding one up. Mr. James Trafford. Note the print. Embossed, heavy stock. An address, Savile Row. No profession listed. Is that unusual? For a man of society, not overtly, Holmes said, but in a murder investigation. Deeply. Within the hour, we were at Savile Row, standing outside a discreet building with polished steps and a brass plaque that read simply, J. Trafford, private consultant. Holmes raised his brow. A title that means everything and nothing. The man who answered the door was slight, neatly dressed, and alarmingly courteous. "Mr. Trafford is not in this morning," he said. "May I inquire as to your business?" Holmes smiled mildly. "We are old acquaintances. He would know me as Mr. Sigerson." The man blinked, then bowed. "If you'll wait in the lounge, I'll see if his assistant may speak to you." We were ushered into a room of quiet opulence, dark wood, leather chairs, and books arranged with surgical neatness. There was nothing of warmth in it. Holmes examined the room with idle interest until the assistant entered. A young woman, pale and formal, with eyes that rarely lifted from the floor. "I understand you've come regarding Mr. Trafford," she said, voice flat. "We have," Holmes replied. "We are investigating the death of Miss Clara Penmore." At the name, a tremor ran through her. "I didn't know her well," she said quickly. "She only came here once to deliver something. A letter, I think." She left almost immediately. "Was Mr. Trafford present?" "Yes," the assistant said, "but the meeting was brief. He seemed unsettled after she left. He cancelled his appointments for the rest of the day." "Do you recall when this was?" She hesitated, then said, "About 4 days before she died." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "And have you seen anyone loitering outside your office recently? A man with a birthmark, perhaps?" Now her eyes rose and something flickered in them. "Yes, once. Last week. He stood across the street, just staring. Then he vanished." Holmes stood. "Thank you. You've been most helpful. Should Mr. Trafford return, please tell him Mr. Sigerson sends his regards." We left promptly, Holmes deep in thought. It was not until we had rounded the corner and reached the more crowded thoroughfare that he spoke. "We have a timeline now. Clara delivers a letter. Trafford grows anxious. Tyne appears soon after, and 4 days later, Clara is dead. Then she confronted Trafford with something, or warned him, which would explain her distress at the recital. She feared she had miscalculated." Back at Baker Street, Miss Reedon met us at the door with a letter in hand, her expression pale. "It came for me an hour ago," she said. "No name, no return address. Just this." Holmes took the envelope and examined it without touching the paper directly. "Watson, the tongs." I passed them to him, and he removed the folded sheet within. The handwriting was careful, impersonal. "Do not pursue what you do not understand." Clara misstepped. "Do not do the same. There is nothing more to find." Holmes turned it over. No signature, no seal. And yet, this was not sent by Tyne. The phrasing lacks the coldness of a scientist. It is more legal, more calculating. Trafford, without question. "She's in danger, isn't she?" I said. Holmes didn't answer. He moved to the fireplace and burned the letter. "He knows we're close, and now he's attempting deterrence." That evening, Lestrade arrived bearing documents Holmes had requested. He dropped them onto the table with a grunt. "Trafford's file. Quiet fellow, high society connections, once considered for diplomatic service. Odd thing is, there's no real record of income." Holmes flipped through the pages. "Of course not. He doesn't earn, he manages. Or more precisely, he covers. I'd wager his finances come through layered holdings and silent partnerships, perfect for someone who wishes to operate beyond scrutiny." He paused at one page, then tapped it. "Here. A trust connected to a certain Baron Hartridge. An old case, I recall. Embezzlement, buried by Parliament. Trafford was his advisor." Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "And you think he's continuing such work?" "I think he's learned how to erase things, and people, who become inconvenient." That night, we laid our trap. Miss Reedon, though visibly shaken, agreed to play her part. We crafted a message and delivered it to Trafford's office via private courier. It stated that she had remembered more, that she had retrieved Clara's final letter, and that she would bring it to the yard the next morning unless given reason not to. We waited. At precisely 10 o'clock, A knock came at the door. Holmes opened it, and there stood a man, tall, handsome, impeccably dressed, his gloved left hand resting lightly on a silver-headed cane, a faint, practiced smile on his lips, the kind that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Holmes," said James Trafford smoothly, "I believe we have matters to discuss." Holmes stepped aside. "Indeed, Mr. Trafford. Do come in." As the door closed behind him, the air seemed to thicken, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, the peril we were now in, not from poison or shadow, but from a man who killed not with rage, but with quiet necessity, and he had come to see if we were, at last, necessary. Trafford entered with the poise of a man accustomed to silence and power. He glanced once at Miss Reeden, who sat stiffly in the corner, and then turned his attention to Holmes, offering a slight, courteous nod. He removed his gloves slowly, right hand only, the left remaining sheathed in its fine kid leather, a detail Holmes noted without comment. "I must say, Mr. Holmes," Trafford began, his voice level and smooth as lacquered wood, "you've been exceedingly persistent. One might almost call it obsession, were it not for your reputation." Holmes motioned him toward the chair opposite the fire. "Call it what you will, Mr. Trafford. I prefer to think of it as precision in pursuit of clarity." "I see," Trafford said, lowering himself with feline grace. "And is it clarity you seek in a matter that has already been resolved? A young woman died. Tragically, yes, but naturally. The inquest ruled as much." "Indeed," Holmes said, seating himself, fingertips pressed together. "Yet she was afraid, and the inquest did not address the man she feared, nor the other young woman who remembers him." Trafford's eyes flicked to Miss Reeden again. She looked away quickly. "Fear is a peculiar lens," he murmured. "It magnifies shadows, invents meaning where there is none." Holmes gave a thin smile. "And yet I find shadows often hold shape if one has patience. You were acquainted with Clara Penmore." "In passing," Trafford said. "She was a companion to Lady Rutledge, whom I've known for many years. We spoke on occasion. I found her intelligent, though somewhat anxious. Anxious enough to confront you with a letter. A warning, perhaps." Trafford did not blink. "You presume too much." "And yet you came," Holmes said quietly, "in response to a fabricated claim about such a letter. Miss Reeden has no such document, only memory. But your appearance proves the possibility of exposure still unsettles you." Trafford's composure remained, but I noted the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth. "You are playing a dangerous game, Mr. Holmes." Holmes rose, and the firelight caught his eyes, giving them a glint of steel. "No more dangerous than yours, Trafford. Tell me, was it your intention that Clara collapse in the garden? Or had the dosage been miscalculated?" There was silence. Trafford's gaze remained locked on Holmes, unflinching, unafraid. Yet something beneath that polished veneer shifted, almost imperceptibly. He stood slowly, drawing on his glove. "She was not meant to die," he said at last, voice low and deliberate. "She was meant to be discredited. Because she witnessed something? Because she understood something," Trafford said. "And understanding, as you well know, can be fatal in certain circles." Holmes nodded, the faintest motion. "And Tyne?" Trafford's jaw moved slightly. "A relic, a liability." He tried to intervene, clumsily. His methods made things worse. "You manipulated them both," Holmes said, stepping forward. "You knew Tyne's presence would terrify her. You relied on it. And when she reached out for help, when she remembered what the package in Henrietta Place truly was, a delivery, a message, not a mistake, you were already too deep." Trafford looked from Holmes to me and then, finally, to Miss Reeden. "Then you understand what must happen now?" He took a single step forward. Holmes moved faster. Before Trafford's hand could dip inside his coat, Holmes had seized him by the wrist and twisted. A fine silver object clattered to the floor. It was a small syringe, capped and hidden in a hollowed walking cane. Lestrade burst through the door at that moment, summoned earlier by Holmes under the pretense of a quiet dinner. "You've heard enough?" Holmes asked without turning. "More than," Lestrade said grimly. "Mr. Trafford, you'll come with me." For the first time, Trafford's expression cracked, and something hollow emerged. A flicker of rage quickly smoothed away. He allowed himself to be cuffed, though not before looking back at Holmes with a final, unreadable glance. "You play well," he said, "but the game is never over. Not in this city." After he had gone, Miss Reedon slumped back into her chair, tears escaping in silence down her cheeks. Holmes stood over the fireplace, his silhouette dark against the flickering flames. "There are men," he said softly, "who wear their crimes like perfumes, subtle, expensive, and nearly invisible. But always, always, there is a trace left behind." I moved to the chair beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You were brave," I said. "I was lucky," she whispered. "Clara wasn't." Holmes turned. "Clara was wise enough to leave us a thread, even if she never lived to see it followed. And you, Miss Reedon, were wise enough to pick it up." Outside, the city hummed on, indifferent and immense, as though nothing had shifted. But inside that narrow flat on Baker Street, something had, justice, delayed and imperfect, had still found its course. Holmes did not speak for a long time after Trafford was gone. When he finally did, it was with the quiet gravity of one who knows the war goes on long after the battle ends. "There are more like him, Watson. But tonight we have claimed one." The weeks that followed Mr. Trafford's arrest were marked by an unsettling quiet at Baker Street, a lull in the storm rather than its end. Miss Reedon remained with us, slowly regaining her composure beneath Mrs. Hudson's diligent care, though the shadows of her ordeal clung stubbornly to her eyes. Holmes, meanwhile, resumed his familiar vigil by the window, alternately brooding and immersing himself in volumes of obscure medical texts and legal treatises. It was during one of these prolonged silences that a letter arrived, its envelope bearing the seal of the Home Office. I handed it to Holmes, who unfolded the crisp paper with a glance that betrayed more curiosity than surprise. "Lestrade writes," he murmured, scanning the lines. "Trafford has confessed to multiple offenses, including conspiracy to poison, obstruction of justice, and manipulation of medical records. But there is one detail that demands our attention. The whereabouts of Dr. Oberon Tyne remain unknown." I raised an eyebrow. "So Tyne is still at large?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. Trafford's confession confirms that Tyne was involved, but offers little beyond vague threats and bitter recriminations. He vanished shortly after the recital, no doubt alerted to our pursuit." Miss Reedon looked up from her chair. "What does that mean for me?" Holmes met her gaze with steady assurance. "It means that your vigilance remains crucial. Tyne may yet attempt to silence those who remember." Determined to close the circle, Holmes proposed a course of action that required careful discretion. "We must visit Henrietta Place, where the package was dropped, and examine any lingering traces." The street was a narrow, cobbled thoroughfare lined with brick townhouses, their facades darkened by time and soot. As we approached the exact spot Miss Reedon had described, a corner near an apothecary's shop, Holmes knelt and ran a gloved finger along the base of a drain pipe. "Notice the faint residue here," he said, producing a small vial from his pocket. "Chemical analysis will confirm if this is the alkaloid compound Tyne specialized in. Such traces often remain long after the poison's effect has vanished." A young constable watched us with curious eyes as Holmes collected samples. I took the opportunity to inquire about recent comings and goings. "No one suspicious, sir," the officer reported. "But there's been talk of a man fitting your description, tall, gloved hand, seen loitering around at night." "Precisely our quarry," Holmes said grimly. "Thank you, Constable." Back at Baker Street, the analysis returned positive. Traces of cardiac alkaloids consistent with Tyne's known expertise. Holmes rubbed his chin thoughtfully. This confirms that Tyne intended harm not only through Trafford, but acted independently as well. His methodical nature suggests he has retreated to a secure location, perhaps one linked to his old affiliations. We turned our attention to the Royal College of Surgeons' records and correspondence archives, seeking a clue to Tyne's possible refuge. Hours of poring over ledgers and letters revealed a pattern, several undated communications from Tyne to a forgotten colleague, Professor Eustace Hawthorne, known for his secluded estate in the outskirts of Surrey. With Lestrade's reluctant approval, Holmes and I arranged to visit the estate under the guise of medical consultants. The journey through Surrey's rolling hills was a sharp contrast to London's grimy streets, but as we neared Hawthorne's estate, a foreboding stillness settled over the landscape. The house itself was a sprawling Gothic structure, its stone walls entwined with ivy and the windows dark beneath heavy drapes. A servant admitted us with little ceremony and led us to a dimly lit study where Professor Hawthorne awaited. He was a thin, austere man with sharp eyes that flicked between us like a hawk's. Holmes wasted no time. "Professor, we seek your assistance in locating Dr. Oberon Tyne. He is implicated in a series of grievous offenses and may be in danger." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Tyne is no friend of mine. He was reckless and consumed by his obsessions. If he sought refuge here, it was without my consent. Have you seen him recently?" He vanished months ago after sending cryptic messages about cleansing and new beginnings. I feared the worst. Holmes leaned forward. "Did Tyne ever mention a secret laboratory or hidden workshop?" The professor hesitated. "There is an old barn on the estate, long unused. I warned him against meddling there, but he paid no heed." Our visit ended with Hawthorne's reluctant directions. The barn lay beyond the main house, shadowed beneath ancient oaks. Its door was swollen with damp, but Holmes forced it open with little difficulty. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint odor of chemicals. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with glassware, powders, and tattered notebooks. A work table bore signs of recent use, a smudge of dark liquid, a half-filled syringe, and a scattered pile of correspondence. Holmes carefully examined the papers. "These are Tyne's notes," he said. "Plans for a compound, refined and deadly. He has not abandoned his craft." Suddenly, a noise echoed from the loft above, a scraping, deliberate and cautious. Holmes drew his revolver with fluid grace, signaling for silence. We ascended the narrow stairs, every sense alert. At the top, crouched amid broken crates and dust motes, was a man, the unmistakable figure of Oberon Tyne. His face was gaunt, eyes wild but clear. His left hand trembled, gloved as ever. "Holmes," he said hoarsely, "I expected you would come." "We have questions," Holmes said calmly. "Why Clara Penmore? Why the poison and fear?" Tyne laughed, a sound brittle and cracked. "She was collateral, an unfortunate witness. I sought to protect truths too dangerous to reveal. Trafford corrupted everything." "And what of Miss Reedon?" I asked. "She has been drawn into your web unwillingly." Tyne's gaze softened briefly. "She is fortunate to have you." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You will come with us, Tyne. Justice will hear your story." Tyne nodded slowly. "Very well. But beware. The truths you seek may not bring peace." As we descended from the barn, the sky overhead was streaked with crimson. The last light before darkness fell over Surrey. The case, with all its shadows and secrets, was drawing to a close. But as Holmes had warned, some truths leave scars that never fully heal. The ride back to London was enveloped in an uneasy silence. Tyne sat between Holmes and me, his gloved hand resting heavily on his cane, eyes lost in the shifting scenery beyond the carriage window. I found myself reflecting on the complex web that had ensnared Clara Penmore, Miss Reedon, and now these two men of such disparate but intertwined fates. Holmes broke the quiet at last, his voice measured but firm. "Doctor, Tyne, you mentioned truths too dangerous to reveal. We must understand what these were, for the sake of justice and for those who have suffered." Tyne's gaze flickered to Holmes, the faintest trace of weariness crossing his sharp features. Clara was caught in the crossfire of a deeper conspiracy, a manipulation that reached far beyond petty crimes or personal vendettas. Trafford was the visible hand, but others pulled strings behind curtains. I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. Who else was involved? Tyne's mouth tightened. I cannot say with certainty. My investigations pointed toward influential figures within the medical establishment and political circles, those who would destroy any threat to their interests. Clara's discovery was incidental but dangerous. Holmes nodded slowly. And the package she picked up on Henrietta Place. A message, a ledger of transactions, names, dates, accounts, proof of illicit dealings hidden beneath respectable facades. "Why not bring this to the authorities sooner?" I asked. Tyne gave a bitter laugh. "Because the authorities were part of the machinery. Fear kept me silent, and Trafford's interference ensured the ledger never surfaced." Miss Reedon, seated quietly, finally spoke. "So Clara was trying to expose this?" "Yes," Tyne said softly. "She was brave. Too brave." The carriage jolted as we approached the city's outskirts, and Holmes's expression grew determined. "Watson, we must secure that ledger. It will bring the whole matter into the light." At Baker Street, we summoned Lestrade and laid out the revelations. The ledger, though currently in fragments, could be pieced together from Tyne's notes and the partial documents found at the barn. Lestrade's eyes narrowed with renewed resolve. "This will bring powerful enemies, Holmes," he warned. "They won't go quietly." Holmes smiled thinly. "Nor will we let them." Over the next days, Holmes and I worked with Tyne and Lestrade to reconstruct the ledger's contents. It detailed illicit exchanges of funds disguised as medical research grants, bribes to silence whistleblowers, and falsified deaths to cover inconvenient truths. Clara Penmore had stumbled upon the tip of a vast and rotten iceberg. One evening, as Holmes and I reviewed a newly restored page, a soft tapping sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a small package, left anonymously but bearing no indication of sender. Holmes opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper, carefully folded, and a dried violet. He read aloud the message, written in a hand both elegant and threatening. "Cease your inquiries, or the next to forget will be you." The room chilled. Miss Reedon trembled. Holmes's gaze darkened. "They know we are close. The danger grows." Yet despite the threat, the pursuit continued with unyielding resolve. Every clue we uncovered led us deeper into the heart of corruption and peril. Miss Reedon's courage never waned, though the weight upon her seemed to grow heavier. The ledger's final pages implicated individuals of immense influence, names that carried weight in government and society. Holmes devised a careful plan, working with Lestrade to prepare arrests and public disclosures that would dismantle the conspiracy without igniting chaos. The night before the planned action, Holmes stood at the window, staring out into the fog that rolled across London streets. He spoke softly, as if addressing the city itself. "Truth is a lantern in the darkness, Watson. It can be extinguished, but its flame endures in those who dare to hold it." I looked at him, sensing that beneath his usual calm there was a fierce fire, an unshakable belief that justice, no matter how delayed, would prevail. The morning dawned cold and clear as police moved to detain the conspirators. News of the arrests spread swiftly, shaking the foundations of those once thought untouchable. In the days that followed, Miss Reeden found a measure of peace, her role in unveiling the truth acknowledged quietly, but sincerely. Holmes, ever the enigma, returned to his violin and his pipe, the case closed but its echoes lingering in the air like the last notes of a haunting melody. And as I pen these final words, I am reminded once more of the fragile balance between memory and forgetfulness. The girl who remembered too late, but whose courage ensured that darkness could not claim the final word. The city, having been shaken to its core by the revelations we had unearthed, was settling into a tentative calm by the time Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The ledger's exposure had forced the hands of those who once operated behind masks of respectability. Arrests had been made, trials were underway, and the slow wheels of justice began to turn with a grim determination. Yet, beneath this outward appearance of closure, an undercurrent of unease persisted, a reminder that power rarely relinquishes itself without resistance. Miss Reeden had returned to her modest lodgings, though I made it a point to visit her regularly, for the ordeal had left scars that no amount of justice could immediately erase. On one such visit, I found her by the window staring into the grey London drizzle, a quiet strength settling over her demeanour. She greeted me with a faint smile, but said little, as though the weight of what had passed still held her in a delicate suspension. Back at Baker Street, Holmes was restless. His mind, ever restless, sought the next problem even before the last was laid to rest. One evening, as the gas lamps cast their golden glow through the haze, Holmes shared his thoughts, pacing as he spoke. The conspiracy we uncovered is but a single strand in the vast tapestry of this city's secrets, Watson. There are always those who trade in shadows, who cloak their deeds beneath layers of deception. I nodded, mindful of the countless cases we had faced where the surface truth concealed deeper, darker currents. Do you believe there remains a threat connected to this case? Holmes stopped, his gaze sharp as a scalpel. There is always risk when men of such influence fall. Retribution is a bitter fruit. His tone turned contemplative. But more immediate is the matter of Miss Reeden's safety. While the principal actors are detained, there may yet be those who would silence witnesses or conceal inconvenient truths through other means. It was then that a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a note on a silver tray. Holmes took it with a frown and read aloud, "Meet me at the Criterion Theatre at 9 tonight. Alone. A friend." A friend, indeed, was a curious designation under such circumstances. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the prospect of a new lead. "That evening," Holmes said, "we venture once more into the heart of the city's labyrinth." Arriving at the Criterion, we found the lobby dim and nearly deserted, save for a solitary figure waiting near the velvet curtains, a man whose face was shadowed beneath a low hat. As Holmes approached, the figure stepped forward into the faint light. "Mr. Holmes," the man said softly, "you must forgive the clandestine manner, but discretion is paramount." Holmes inclined his head. "Speak freely." The stranger produced a folded letter, worn at the edges. This was found among the belongings of a recently deceased clerk, a man who had access to the ledgers you recovered. He feared the consequences of his knowledge. Holmes accepted the letter, his fingers steady despite the weight of expectation. Unfolding the paper, he scanned the terse lines. "There is one who remains free, the architect of the cover-up. His name is concealed beneath layers of proxy, but I can point you to a symbol, a black seal stamped with the crest of the Eglinton family. Beware the shadows of Mayfair. The final piece awaits there." Holmes folded the letter carefully. "Watson, the Eglintons. Old money, powerful, and above reproach to all but a few." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the theatre's interior. So our case is far from over? Holmes's eyes were alight. Far from over indeed. This is the closing act, but it will be the most perilous. Under cover of night, we made our way to the Eglinton estate in Mayfair. The grandeur of the mansion belied the cold calculation we suspected dwelled within. Holmes had arranged a discreet introduction through mutual acquaintances, gaining us access under the guise of consulting on philanthropic matters. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with opulence and unspoken menace. We met Lord Eglinton himself, a man of imposing stature and impeccable manners, whose smile did not quite reach his eyes. "I understand you have concerns, Mr. Holmes," the Lord said, smoothly. "The city thrives on rumors and intrigue, but I assure you, my family is beyond reproach." Holmes responded with measured calm. "Respectfully, my lord, the truth does not bend to station. There are questions that demand answers." As the evening unfolded, Holmes probed subtly, drawing connections between Eglinton's financial dealings and the shadowy transactions unearthed in the ledger. The Lord's veneer of civility began to crack, revealing flashes of impatience and veiled threats. Just as Holmes pressed further, a sudden commotion erupted outside. The hurried footsteps of approaching constables, led by Lestrade and a contingent of officers. "Lord Eglinton," Lestrade announced, "you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The room erupted into shocked whispers and protests, but the evidence compiled by Holmes and his associates was irrefutable. As Eglinton was escorted away, Holmes turned to me, exhaustion flickering in his eyes. "The web is vast, Watson, but the threads are now unraveling." The following days saw a series of hearings that exposed the full depth of the corruption, a network of influence that had sought to smother the truth through intimidation, bribery, and murder. Miss Reedon, now shielded by both the law and the public's sympathy, began to reclaim her life, though the shadows of the past lingered. One evening, as we sat together at 221B, Holmes mused quietly. The girl who remembered too late did not merely preserve memory. She kindled a flame that illuminated even the darkest corners. I nodded, struck by the profound truth of his words. As the lamps burned low and the fog drifted outside, I penned these final reflections, ever grateful for the clarity Holmes brought to a world often shrouded in mystery. For in the end, it is not only the sharpness of mind, but the courage to remember and to act upon memory that defines justice. And thus concluded the curious case of the girl who remembered too late. The days that followed Lord Eglinton's arrest were marked by a peculiar kind of quiet in London. Not the calm of resolution, but the hushed expectancy that precedes the settling of dust over shattered facades. Baker Street resumed its usual rhythms, but beneath the familiar sounds of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps and the crackle of the fire, a new tension lingered, the knowledge that though one chapter had closed, the echoes of its revelations would continue to ripple through the city's undercurrents. Holmes and I spent many hours in discourse, sifting through the intricacies of the case, reviewing our notes and anticipating the inevitable legal battles that would follow. Miss Reedon's health improved steadily, her presence a quiet testament to the courage that had set the entire investigation in motion. One late afternoon, as the autumn sun dipped low behind the chimneys, casting long shadows into our sitting room, a soft knock heralded the arrival of Inspector Lestrade. His usually brisk demeanor was tinged with weariness. "Holmes, Watson," he greeted us. "I've come with news. From the trial front and beyond." Holmes gestured for him to continue, his eyes sharp beneath his furrowed brow. "The hearings have brought more than just Eglinton to light. Documents uncovered during the searches have implicated several high-ranking officials. Resignations and inquiries are underway, though much remains concealed." Lestrade sighed heavily. "But there's more troubling news. A letter was intercepted this morning, threatening in nature, aimed at Miss Reedon. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, the weight of this fresh peril settling upon us like a shroud. "Has she been warned?" Holmes asked. "Of course," Lestrade replied. "We've doubled her protection, but the sender remains unknown. Whoever it is, they have resources and determination." Holmes stood abruptly, the familiar fire kindling in his gaze. "Then our work is far from over." That evening, Holmes and I accompanied Miss Reeden on a brief walk, both as a show of support and to gauge her state of mind. The streets were alive with the usual bustle, yet every shadow seemed to lengthen with unseen menace. As we passed beneath a gas lamp, Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on a figure across the street. A man in a dark overcoat, his hat pulled low, watching us intently. Holmes's jaw tightened. "We are being observed," he murmured. A reminder that even as justice progresses, darkness clings stubbornly. The following days saw Holmes employing every resource at his disposal: discreet surveillance, coded communications with Lestrade, and careful orchestration of Miss Reeden's movements. Meanwhile, the trial progressed, unfolding a tapestry of greed, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by the exposure of such formidable foes, and the courts buzzed with the excitement of a scandal that reached into the highest echelons. One evening, as Holmes and I reviewed transcripts by candlelight, he paused and looked toward the window. "Watson, this case has reminded me that memory, while fragile, is a formidable weapon. Miss Reeden's delayed recollection set in motion a chain that dismantled a great deceit. It is a testament to the power of truth, and to those brave enough to seek it." I nodded, my pen poised over my notebook, feeling once again the weight and wonder of the detective's mind at work. As the final verdicts approached, London held its breath. The guilty were condemned, and the innocent vindicated, yet the scars remained, on those who suffered and on the city itself. In the quiet that followed, Holmes and I sat by the fire, the case closed, but the lessons lingering. "Remember, Watson," he said softly, "sometimes the most dangerous adversaries are those who believe they have forgotten, and those who remember, even too late, hold the key to justice." And so, with a final glance toward the foggy window, our minds turned to the future, knowing full well that London's mysteries would never cease, and neither would the pursuit of truth. The following morning, the familiar knock at our door heralded an unexpected visitor, a courier bearing a sealed envelope with no return address, its wax insignia embossed with a crest unfamiliar to me. Holmes took the envelope with a measured calm, breaking the seal with a practiced hand, then unfolding the letter within. His eyes skimmed the contents rapidly, and for the first time in many days, a shadow crossed his features, a mixture of intrigue and caution. "Watson," he said quietly, "it appears that even as we celebrate the conclusion of one chapter, another stirs in the depths." He handed me the letter. Its message was brief but ominous. "The truth is a mirror shattered by many hands. Beware whose reflection you trust. The game is far from finished." I felt a chill despite the warmth of our rooms, recognizing in Holmes's gaze the gravity such words conveyed. "Do you believe this is connected to the case we have just closed?" Holmes nodded. "It must be. The Eglinton affair, with its intricate deceptions, surely has left behind factions unwilling to accept defeat. This letter is a summons, a challenge." Miss Reeden, who had entered silently and now stood near the window, turned toward us. Her voice was steady but carried an edge of unease. "Do you think they will come for me again?" Holmes met her eyes with resolve. "If they do, they will find us ready." That evening, under the cloak of London's mist, Holmes and I attended a gathering at a discreet club frequented by the city's elite and shadowy figures alike. We sought to glean information on the author of the letter and the factions that might oppose justice. The air was thick with cigar smoke and whispered secrets, the walls echoing with the hum of deals struck in the dark. Through careful conversation and subtle inquiries, Holmes identified a name, one linked to an elusive cabal known only as the Black Seal. Their reach extended into politics, finance, and beyond, protecting interests through intimidation and silence. As the night deepened, a sudden commotion erupted outside. Holmes's keen eyes caught a figure slipping away into the fog. A messenger, perhaps, or a scout. We followed at a distance, weaving through alleys until the man vanished into a dimly lit doorway. Inside, we found a hidden room lined with documents and coded correspondences, left abandoned in haste. Among them, a ciphered note hinted at plans to undermine the legal proceedings and discredit key witnesses. Holmes set to work deciphering the message, his fingers deft and sure. Hours passed before the code yielded its secret. A conspiracy to launch a smear campaign against Miss Reedon, aimed at eroding public trust and silencing her voice. Returning to Baker Street with the evidence in hand, Holmes contacted Lestrade, urging immediate protective measures. Miss Reedon was placed under careful watch, and discreet inquiries began into the members of the Black Seal. Days later, the city buzzed with rumors of another scandal, and Miss Reedon's name appeared in whispered warnings. Yet she remained steadfast, her courage unwavering in the face of renewed threats. One evening, as the fog curled around the gas lamps outside, Holmes sat by the fire, his violin resting untouched. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. The cost of truth is often measured in shadows cast behind the light. I listened, aware that though the visible battle had been won, the war for justice in London's labyrinthine corridors was far from over. In the weeks that followed, we watched and waited, ready to meet whatever darkness sought to silence the girl who had remembered too late, and who, through memory and courage, had illuminated a path none could ignore. And thus, the tale remains unfinished, a reminder that in the dance between light and shadow, vigilance is the price of justice, and remembrance its most potent weapon. The damp chill of the London evening clung to the streets as Holmes and I made our way from Baker Street toward the heart of the city's shadowed alleys. The warning letter, now burned into my memory, had set a new urgency upon our steps. The Black Seal, as Holmes had uncovered, was no mere whisper in the underworld. It was a force lurking just beneath the surface of respectable society, ready to smother any flicker of truth. We arrived at a modest tavern tucked away near Fleet Street, its sign swinging creakily in the wind. Here, Holmes said, we might find one of the cabal's lesser associates, a courier known only as Fletcher. The man was said to carry secrets and whispers, but none knew his true face. Inside, the tavern was thick with smoke and the murmur of quiet conversations. Holmes's sharp gaze scanned the room before settling on a gaunt figure in the corner, nursing a cup of weak ale and casting furtive glances around. We approached quietly. "Fletcher," Holmes said, voice low but commanding. The man startled, eyes widening before recognition dawned. "Mr. Holmes?" he muttered. "I did not expect you here." Holmes inclined his head. "I require information." Fletcher hesitated, then leaned in. "The Black Seal moves to silence Miss Reedon. There are plans to discredit her further. False accusations, forged letters, even threats designed to fracture her mind." Holmes's eyes burned with resolve. "And the timing?" "Imminent. Within days, perhaps hours." Holmes turned to me. "We must act swiftly, Watson." The following days blurred with activity. Holmes coordinated with Lestrade and a trusted few to protect Miss Reedon and to intercept the cabal's maneuvers. The city, oblivious to the quiet war raging beneath its fog, carried on, unaware that its fate hinged on the courage of a few. One morning, a coded dispatch arrived at Baker Street. an invitation to a clandestine meeting of the Black Seal at a manor outside London. Holmes immediately prepared to infiltrate, recognizing the opportunity to strike at the cabal's heart. Dressed in plain clothes and under cover of dusk, we journeyed to the manor. The estate was imposing, wreathed in ivy and shadow, its windows glowing faintly through the mist. Holmes's plan was meticulous. Gain entrance as servants, observe, and gather evidence without detection. Inside, the grand hall was filled with figures cloaked in anonymity, voices lowered in conspiratorial tones. We listened as names were whispered, bribes discussed, and plans hatched to undermine the reform sweeping the city's institutions. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he recognized several attendees from prior investigations, men once thought untouchable. Suddenly, a whispered alarm rang through the hall. Someone had discovered our presence. Chaos erupted. Holmes seized my arm. "Follow me." We darted through corridors, evading guards, until we burst into the night air. The manor was alive with shouts and pursuit. We fled into the fog-laden woods, hearts pounding, but a sudden branch caught my foot and I stumbled, twisting my ankle. Holmes caught me swiftly. "Can you continue?" I gritted my teeth. "Yes, we must." Guided by Holmes's steady hand, we reached the edge of the estate, where a waiting carriage awaited. We escaped into the night, the manor's angry lights receding behind us. Back at Baker Street, despite my injury, the evidence we carried was undeniable. The documents and recordings exposed the Black Seal's intentions and members, allowing Lestrade to coordinate a series of arrests that shook the city once more. As calm returned, Holmes sat beside the fire, tending to my ankle. He looked at me thoughtfully. "Watson, this case has tested us. Memory, courage, endurance. Yet it is in perseverance that justice is forged." I nodded, feeling the weariness seep into my bones, but also the quiet pride in our work. Miss Reedon, though forever changed, found renewed strength in the light of truth. Her role in unveiling the conspiracy became a beacon for others. And so, as the autumn leaves turned and the London fog lifted, I reflected on the journey. The girl who remembered too late had, through her remembrance, changed the course of many lives. Holmes finally set down his violin, a rare smile touching his lips. "The city sleeps a little safer tonight, Watson, but vigilance must never wane." And with that, the night settled, and we prepared for whatever mysteries the morrow might bring. The dawn broke over London with a tentative light, the morning fog retreating as if in deference to the justice we had so arduously pursued. Within the quiet confines of 221B Baker Street, the final threads of the case wove themselves into a tapestry, both intricate and complete. Holmes sat by the hearth, pipe in hand, eyes gleaming not with triumph, but with the cool satisfaction of one who has unraveled the tangled skein of human deceit. "Watson," he began, his voice calm yet resonant. "This case hinged not merely on a single memory, but on the interplay of concealment and revelation. Let us retrace the path." He motioned to the map pinned to the wall, marked with the points of inquiry. The recital, Henrietta Place, the laboratory, the ledger, the Eglinton estate, and finally the manor where the Black Seal convened. The apparent culprit, Lord Eglinton, was but a shield for a far more insidious network, one whose reach sought to smother Clara Penmore's discovery before it could ignite reform. Holmes's gaze met mine. But what of the letter that summoned us to the Criterion and the threats thereafter? They were designed to misdirect, to fracture our attention. I nodded, recalling the labyrinth of clues that had at times confounded even Holmes. Miss Reedon's memory, delayed though it was, served as the catalyst, Holmes continued. Yet she alone was never the target. The true danger lay in the ledger, a compendium of corruption hidden beneath the veneer of society. Holmes tapped the ledger's reconstructed pages. Our final triumph came from recognizing the ledger's true custodian, the man whose influence superseded even Eglinton's. I waited, sensing the culmination. Holmes's eyes sparkled as he revealed the final twist. The mastermind was none other than Sir Reginald Pritchard, a figure so well ensconced in the establishment that even the Black Seal deferred to his will. It was he who orchestrated the smoke screens, the poisonings, the silencing. I leaned forward. Pritchard. The name never arose openly in the trials. Precisely, Holmes said. His hand was invisible, but his signature unmistakable once we followed the ledger's hidden cipher, a code only decipherable by those versed in classical symbology. The Black Seal was his emblem, adopted by the Cabal but originating from Pritchard's family crest. Holmes produced a folded letter, previously overlooked, penned in disguised script. This missive sealed Clara's fate. Pritchard feared exposure, and through Trafford and Tyne sought to neutralize the threat. But how did we uncover his involvement? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. The smallest detail, Watson, the particular violet found with the threatening letter. Pritchard was known for his obsession with that flower, often sending them as tokens. It was the clue that allowed us to look beyond the obvious. Miss Reedon, present and listening quietly, met Holmes's gaze with gratitude and resolve. The girl who remembered too late, Holmes concluded, did not simply recall a moment. She rekindled a quest for justice that no power could extinguish. As the morning sun filtered through the curtains, I reflected on the profound truth of Holmes's words. The case had been a testament to the delicate interplay between memory and action, courage and caution, shadow and light. Though London's streets would always harbor secrets, that day one darkness had been pushed back. Not by force alone, but by the persistence of those who dared to remember and to seek the truth. Holmes leaned back, pipe glowing softly. Now, Watson, shall we prepare for the next mystery? For as ever, the game is afoot. And with that, the city stirred awake, oblivious to the quiet triumph within its heart, while two men, detective and chronicler, readied themselves to meet the enigmas yet to come.